Hill. I'm sharing with you a photo that I took in November of 2010. The photo was taken in a little rural cemetery in the hamlet of New Salem, New York, near the Albany area. And as you can see, it's a Civil War monument in this cemetery. And this Union soldier is looking westward as the sun drops over the Helderberg Ridge, which is a really beautiful ridgeline. I don't know when this monument was erected, but I assume, based on the age of the cemetery, that it was probably within a generation or two of the end of the Civil War, and Civil War veterans who were buried there years after the war ended. And of course, this type of monument, this soldier standing at attention, is not particular to this cemetery. They're all throughout the country. Several weeks ago, I was in the very beautiful town of Honesdale, Pennsylvania, and in the town square there is a Civil War monument. And that monument there in Honesdale was erected in 1869, which was only 4 years after the end of this very bloody conflict, which took the lives of hundreds of thousands of American men, particularly men from places like Pennsylvania, who fought to preserve the Union. And it struck me that this monument was put up so quickly after the end of the Civil War. And it got me thinking just how many people have, throughout the last 150 years or so, passed monuments just like these, either through a town square on their way to transact some business, or in cemeteries as they go to decorate the headstones of their beloved. And it strikes me because so much has changed in this country. Obviously, things change, but so much has changed since the end of the first Civil War. And I say the first Civil War because I think it's unfortunately true that we are in a bit of a civil war right now, a cold civil war, a civil war that has not gone kinetic and perhaps and hopefully won't. I think you have to be living under a rock to not notice the incredible divisions in our country right now. And that's okay, because I can understand why people would want to tune things out right now. We have perhaps had the previews of hot conflict over the last few years, particularly in the summer of 2019 and 2020. But we've seen it, and it's upsetting because the United States, for all its faults, truly is the freest country on the planet. And as I said, hundreds of thousands of men died to preserve this union. And what's really troubling right now is something that you see on social media, and now even increasingly in the mainstream media, which is the talk of this second Civil War. I think that people on different sides, let's just say the red side, the Republican side, and the blue side, the Democrat side, think that a second Civil War, a hot Civil War, a comprehensive nationwide Civil War, so to speak, would perhaps solve the problems, the deep divisions, the economic divisions, and the cultural divisions that they face. One side, the right, likes to joke that the left side wouldn't be able to fight because it doesn't even know what bathroom to use. The other side, the left side or the Democratic side, likes to imagine that the U.S. military would put a quick end to the right. And they would do this perhaps with F-16s or tanks or drones or boots on the ground. And I'm no expert on military conflict or civil war, but I think both of these views are incredibly naive and very dangerous, actually. They give both sides a air of confidence that is not only unearned, but is completely irrelevant. America is radically different in 2022 than it was in 1865 when the peace treaty was signed in Virginia. First of all, we are a union of more states. We are a country that has a greater diversity of ethnicities, and people with differing political views are more likely to live among one another than was the case during the antebellum years before the Civil War. I'll take, for example, myself. I live in a pretty deep red area of a very deep blue state. And the inverse is true in, say, a state like Texas, where you have a relatively red state, at least politically, but you have pockets that are deep blue. And despite all of the ideological and political self-separation that may be existing in this country, people still do live and work around those with whom they have massive differences of opinion on matters of economics, culture, and religion, and social issues. This is a very different United States, and any conflict that comes from it is going to look radically different than that which occurred 160 years ago. This won't be a war that has battlefields. Those days are long gone. America is a much different place, and any hot, kinetic civil war that happens will necessarily occur in our main streets, in our communities. It's not going to be held in some designated neutral area and the winner takes all. It's going to be in the communities where we live and we work and we worship and we shop and transact business. And there is so much to lose if this ever happens, and we should pray that it never happens. We can't even conceive of how awful it would be. And I'm going to give just a few reasons for how awful I think this could be. And I understand that there's people out there that feel really strongly that they dislike the other side. Like, I'm on the right. I don't agree with much of the left. I don't agree with the left's social positions pretty much on anything. I find a lot of the left to be wildly out of step with the way human beings are supposed to live. But I still have a lot of pause. I don't want violence being used against people to solve problems. Violence should only be used in self-defense. But enough of my own personal opinions on this. I just want to bring up a couple things. The first thing that would happen if we ever had a civil conflict is we live in a country where there's something like 400 million guns, and I don't know if that means that there's more than one gun for every person, but the violence that could occur just in a flash of an eye could be just catastrophic. It would be like guerrilla-like violence. And this isn't something people are accustomed to in the West. I think it could look more like the civil wars that have raged in Syria or Colombia or during the occupation of Iraq rather than what we imagine. And because that's the case, that means the things that we rely on to live every day, like I'm talking about electricity, clean drinking water, the supply chain that allows us to have food and medical supplies and vaccines and working hospitals, all of that becomes, at least initially, in the firing line. Unless you are already the most dedicated prepper, the idea that you're going to be able to charge your phone and read about the war going on your on your device at night, it's pretty crazy. I have no idea how many millions of people would die within the first few months of a hot civil war in the United States, but it would be pretty insane. The other matter is the United States, although more physically isolated than most of the countries in the world, I mean, we have only 2 countries that border us, is still vulnerable from the outside should things fall apart here on the inside. Let's just think about it for a second. We have clearly a porous border with Mexico right now. A porous border. It can't be denied, no matter what somebody thinks about the people that are coming across the border right now. And I think most of those people are coming across to make for a better lives for themselves, notwithstanding the fact that they might be breaking the law. The border is porous. It's a humanitarian catastrophe right now. But one of the reasons it's a humanitarian catastrophe is that the people that control the other side of the border, and I'm not talking about the Mexican government, I'm talking about the cartels and organized crime, these are people that would necessarily fill the vacuum if a hot war broke out in, say, a place like Texas. They would necessarily become a player. And this is something that happened during the French Revolution, where the opponents of France exploited the internal collapse of France. Even after France was proclaimed a republic, its enemies were always at its gate. And so I think people need to remember that. It's disturbing right now just how much influence cartels have in our country, in our inner cities, even hundreds or thousands of miles away from the border. But if you can imagine a hot civil war, they would most definitely be involved. The other thing, and I think this is something that people on the right would like to deny, but I'm on the right and I'm going to admit this. I think there are enough really reprehensible white nationalist people who would love to have a civil war. And I don't see a civil war being a purely ideological thing in this country. I think it would be like a prison riot. I think there would be people trying to settle scores with one another. And so people on the right, they might think of themselves as necessarily patriotic. And let's be honest, there are people, absolutely reprehensible white nationalist people, who would really enjoy the prospect of a civil war. And I think that the red side, the right side, would have to make a decision right there, what to do with these people. And I think the really tragic thing about warfare is that it makes for strange bedfellows. We see this in Ukraine right now, where you have the Ukrainian army enlisting or using the help of white nationalist, Nazi-aligned soldiers, militias. And on the left side, I think there would be a smaller but still sizable amount of people who might consider themselves black nationalists. And the left, or the Democrat side, if we want to call it that, would have to decide, do you let these people in to your great cause? That's really disturbing to think about. I think that a civil war in this country could become a racial and ethnic war very, very, very quickly. And I think anybody who strives to be a decent person, no matter what their political views are, they have to recognize how incredibly horrible that is. The last thing about a civil war that's really, really disturbing is children. We all want, those of us who have children, we all want something better for them. We want their lives to be good. We want their lives to be safe. When we put them to bed at night, we want them to sleep safely in the night. And when we send them off to school in the morning, we want them to return home safely. Civil war and warfare fall very hard on the most vulnerable. And among our most vulnerable are children. They don't deserve the collapse of this country. They didn't do anything to cause this. They didn't accelerate it. They were born into these circumstances. And as the father of two young boys myself, it's horrifying. I can't even imagine what that would be like for my two children, one of which has special needs, to have to experience this. And yet this is what people experience in other parts of the world where civil war has raged. I don't know what the outcome is going to be. I know that there are people that have placed bets, like social scientists, on how close we are to a civil war. And just last month, we had the President of the United States, I think, throw gasoline on the fire, but I'll try to keep him out of this. We have people openly talking now in the mainstream media about the prospects of civil war. And I think there's this idea that we're all fat, comfortable, and that it couldn't happen, but it could happen. It could happen. Anytime you have people this angry at one another and this armed, it could happen. The prospects of the U.S. military being used against civilians is very frightening. It's not something that people should embrace or want. My hope is that there's a solution out there that doesn't involve any of this. Maybe it involves a decentralization of power from the federal government to the states, with the understanding that the states respect certain inalienable human rights. The rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, I suppose, would be the broad outline. That there be no distinctions among the races, that there be no discrimination built into the system. I think that's the solution right there. It's either a collapse of what we hold dear, or the transformation into something that's really frightening, which is the fusion of state and corporation. Fascism, really. Let's pray, whether you're on the right or on the left, that cool heads can prevail. The coolest of heads can prevail, and that we can avoid this situation, because it really would be terrible. So as I look at these photos that I shared, let's hope that there are no monuments in the future for a second civil war, that it can be avoided completely, whether you're on the right or on the left. Hug your family. Love your country. God bless.